Tov. Is today's daf yomi is Sanhedrin Samachal, Sanhedrin 61, and we're going to start on 61a around. Let's just see where we're going to start. So we're. Oh, that's where it was. We're going to start around 15 lines from the top. Today's daf is dedicated for Shemir, for the Chayalim, Hatzal, for the Shvuyim, and the Yeshua for Am Yisrael. So the Gemara says, Hadam Rebbe, thank you, Bill, for making the bagel for my mother. She's very appreciative. So the Gemara says that which Rebbe we're just finishing off what we were discussing yesterday, and then we'll start the next case. So that which Rebbe Eliezer said, Minayin l'zoveach behema. How do we know that if somebody slaughters an animal out of honor to Markolis, Shilchayev? So typically speaking, you serve Markolis by throwing a stone to it. But this case, you worship the animal out of in one of the ways in which you typically serve Hashem. How do we know you're liable? Because it says, you're not allowed to. And this is, it says you're not allowed to make any more sacrifices to their Seirim. The main Inyan Kedar. Now, this doesn't refer to serving in the normal manner, because we already know in the normal manner is prohibited. They'll serve Echayavdu. So you know that you can't serve them in the normal manner. Taneo Shalo Kedarka. So apply it to one who serves in that service in not in the normal manner. And so therefore, but why do you need to say that? So didn't we already learn that if you serve them in the not typical manner, you're going to be liable? We learned it out from Mishtachava. So the Gemara said, no. Mayor by Markois, we're talking about somebody who slaughters to Markois, but they do it only to anger one's creator, to anger God. And so therefore you can't learn out from Mishtachava, which is a form of service, of humility, but not the anger. And so therefore that's why we need a separate verse. So now the Gemara says, if we're going to discuss the case, if a person says, I am going to serve idolatry, but they don't actually serve it yet, are they going to be liable? And there's going to be a contradiction between two Mishnayos on this, and the Gemara is going to give 7 ways to resolve this contradiction. So Rav Hamnuna irkasule Tori. Rav Hamnuna lost his oxen, and he was searching for his oxen. So Rabba met Rav Hamnuna. When he did that, he threw 2 different Mishnayos against each other. Why do we care that he lost his oxen? It shows us that even when the Torah scholars are losing their oxen, when we lose oxen, we get all discombobulated. We lost our oxen. That could be thousands of dollars. An ox could be $2,000 now. So you can imagine if you lost several oxen, it's going to be like a person's whole livelihood. And yet all he does is thinking about Torah. Now, when we lose our oxen, we're shot. But when he loses his oxen, he engages in Torah. So they serve Hamnuna. So he sees Rabbah and he throws 2 Mishnayos against each other. First of all, we learned in our Mishnah, which we said in yesterday's daf, with respect to the prohibitions of stoning. Ha'oved avodas kochavim, one who worships idolatry. And that implies that when you worship your idolatry, you're going to be liable. Oved in, omer lo, that only when you worship idolatry are you liable. But if you just say, I'm going to go and worship your idolatry, you're not liable. But we learned in the Mishnah on 67a with respect to somebody who encourages somebody to worship idolatry. It's called a mesis. Haomer evod, or if he says elech vavod, he says I'm going to go and worship idolatry. Or if he says I will go and worship idolatry, meaning he hasn't done any action yet. Or if he says nelach v'navod, if he says let's go and worship. Nevertheless, we're saying in all those cases he's liable. So from our case, it means we say that you're only liable if you say ha'oved, if you say I'm going to worship idolatry. Whereas in the Mishnah later on, you're liable even if you just say I will go and worship. So let's go and worship. So how do we deal with this contradiction? Do you have to actually worship, or do you just say I'm going to go and worship? So how do we deal with these questions? So Amar Rav Hamnuna responds to this contradiction, and he says, "Ba'omer eino mekabel olai ela ba'avoda." So our Mishnah that says he's liable only if he worships, but not if he just says it. He was talking about a case. Let me help out you here. That's talking about a case where the change you kimta of the Mishnah. What's the Mishnah talking about? The Mishnah is talking about a case where he says, I'm only going to accept this idol upon myself when I go and worship it. When I go and worship this, then I'm accepting it. So that's how we deal with our Mishnah. But typically speaking, you're liable when you say I will go and worship. So that's the first answer. The Gemara gives a second answer. Rav Yosef Amar Tanai Shakal Mayama. Okay, so you have two Tanaim that are contradicting each other. Tanai Shakal Mayama Tanai. It's a dispute amongst the Tanaim. Welcome to Daf Yomi. That's what basically we study on every other page. The Tanya, what Bryce says. How do we know that this is a dispute? Because the Bryce says that Omer Bo Vivduni, Rabbi Meir Mechayev, Rabbi Huda Poter. If somebody says, come and one person who says to others, come and serve me, he makes it, he says, I am an idol, come and serve me, and he gets others to serve him. Rabbi Meir says that you're liable just for saying it. Whereas Rabbi Huda Poter, Rabbi Huda says you're exempt. And now how do we understand this dispute? Again, what did the person say? The person said, come and worship me. So Rabbi Meir says you're liable, and Rabbi Huda says you're exempt. Now, what circumstance? And now, in a case where they actually went ahead and worshipped him, everybody would agree that he's liable. Because we just said this yesterday. You can't make yourself an idol. Where are they arguing? Where he says, come and worship me, but the guy didn't go and worship him. So Rameir Savar Dibura Milsi, Rameir says that basically just telling the person, come and worship me, without actually him having worship, that's considered to be like you've done something and you're liable. And so that's like the Mishnah on 67a. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda Savar Dibura Lav Milsi, just saying is not anything. You have to actually worship. And so therefore that's the dispute. That's the second approach. Hadar Amar Rav Yosef Lav Milsi Damar. Rav Yosef then himself offers a third approach. He says that which I said the first time is nothing. Dafilu Rabbi Yehuda, even according to Rabbi Yehuda, who we said that Rabbi Yehuda said you're exempt until you go and worship. Even according to Rabbi Yehuda, that you would actually be liable just by speaking. Detanya Rabbi Yehuda Omer Olam Eno Chayev Ad Sheyomar Evod or Elach Evod or Neilch Ben Evod. Rabbi Yehuda says you're liable once you say this expression of just speaking. I will go and worship. Let's go and worship. So the explanation I gave for Rabbi Yehuda is wrong. Impossible, because I know that Rabbi Yehuda says as long as you say it, you're liable. So, but my comment, okay, so what's the dispute between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda? B'meisis la'atzmo, v'amrulei in kamifli, where he says, "Come and worship me. Come and worship me. I'm your God. I'm your God." So that's the dispute. Mar Savar that we're going to say Rabbi Meir says you're liable. Says b'meisis la'atzmo shamilei. The indica amile kushtu, and so Rabbi Meir says that when he says come and worship me, this person will indeed listen to him and will worship him, and now which he says, yes, we'll go and worship you, kushtu, he's saying the truth, he intends to worship him, and that's called a mesis. Umar Savar Rabbi Yehuda's other position, mesis la'atzman lo shamilei, he's not going to listen. He's not going to worship. He's not going to worship him. Meimer Amri, Ma'ishnail Min Didon. Why should I think he's a god? Well, he's no different. I mean, yeah, I play basketball with that dude. He's not my god. And page 61b. The Indica Amri, and that what he said. Yeah, let's go worship you. He's just making fun of him. Umas Nisan, and there's no contradiction between the Mishnayos. Kan, our Mishnah later on, which says you're liable for say you're going to worship him. Biyachad Ani says that's where you're talking about one individual where you're trying to get him to worship. And because since it's one individual, once he says I'll go and worship, he's not going to change his mind. And Kan Berabim Ani Sitim. And here where it says that you're only liable once you worship, it's because we convince the majority and the community, they're going to change their mind. Yachad won't, the individual won't change his mind. And I'll follow him after him and I'll worship idolatry because he says, I'll go and I'll hear. Whereas Rabim, whereas the community, they're not going to make this mistake. Somebody's going to sound minds will prevail. Yeah.
So in this last example, the mere speech of it is not what creates liability, it's the likelihood that you're doing. And if that's the case, why not see if they're happy with it?
Right. It's a good question. It's a very good question. But that's what they're saying. That's their chiddush. That's the point. But right. Amar Rav Yosef, how do I know that an individual who is incited is liable even on just speech alone? Means it says don't lean after him and don't listen to him. So even if you just listen to him, even though you didn't work it, so they have a verse to answer your question, Jeff. Even though you didn't actually work it, you're going to do it, serve it, you're going to be liable. And it said in the singular. Abaye says, "Mi shani bein nisis d'Rabban and nisis d'Yachid." Do you want to really draw a distinction between whether the individual is seduced or the community? It says when your brother seduces you, and it includes even an individual or a community is served. Why is there an individual and why is there a distinction between an individual and the community? And Rabban mikal yachid. There is a distinction. Yachid mikal Rabban lahachmir agufo. An individual is separated from the community. That there's a stringency for the individual. What's that? That he gets stoning. Whereas when the whole community does idolatry, they get sayef, which is less decapitation, and but yet we're lenient for the individual's money because the individual's money is not destroyed, but the community, when they serve, it's destroyed, their money. And Rabban mikol yachid, and why is the community separate from the individual? From they only get decapitation, so it's more lenient than the individual. And we're strict about their money because their money is destroyed. And so we see in that specific case, there's a distinction between the individual and the public, but in general, they're the same. So Abaye says we have to give a different answer. Our Mishnah, which says you're not liable, it's benises mi piatzmo. But rather, he didn't convince others to it's not where he's convincing others to worship, but rather on his own. He says, on his own, he says, I'm going to go and worship. And the Mishnah says later on that you're liable is where others convince him. If it's from himself, mimlach, he'll still have the ability to change his mind. But when others are convincing him, gar basrayo, no, he's not going to be able to turn back. Abaye says, what's the source for this? I'm Abaye minah because it says so let's see. Once he hears it, he's liable. Rava Amar gives a different answer. I think this is maybe the fifth answer or the sixth answer. Yeah, fifth answer. Rava says, in both cases, there are others convinced you. And the Mishnah that says that you're liable, it's where he means to say, he says, this is how you're going to worship him. You're going to eat. This is how he eats. This is how he drinks. This is how this idol does good for others. And so since he heard the praise, he's already down the path. Meaning to say, and one case is where he didn't hear that. And you see, Jeff goes back to Jeff's question. The point is really, today, like, what's worship? A lot of worship is just prayer. A lot of worship is just words, not actually sacrificing. So once you start hearing all the greatness and you're like, okay, I hear it, that's the worship. What's my source? When they'll cause you, Mali Krovim, Mali Rechokim. What does it care if these gods are close to you, the nations are close to you, or far away? What's the difference? So this is what the verse is saying. This is what the verse says to the one who was seduced. Mitivusan shel krovim atalamein mativusan shel chokim. From the matter of those who are close to you, you learn about also the matter of those who are far away and you can't see. Just like those who are close to you, you see that there's nothing to them. So those who are far away, you see there's nothing to them. And Rabbi says, why does the verse need to tell us that those far away have nothing? My love, because he's the person who's seducing you, is telling you all about their greatness. I mean, we see from here that the verse is talking about that that's what you're going to be liable for when you hear that and you say, I'm going to go after them. The sixth approach, Rav Ashi Amar, Deifa B'Yisrael Mumar. So our Mishnah says that the person who seduces is not liable, but when he says, I'll go and worship, until he goes and worship, that's by a regular Jew. But the concluding Mishnah, which says you're liable, is talking about a Yisrael Mumar, a heretic, who's we assume that he's already worshiping, and so therefore, if he gives you advice and you agree, now we can't say, oh, you're going to change your mind, and so therefore you're liable. Now Ravina gives the last answer. Says Lozu Avsu Katani. Not only the Mishnahs are together, they're not contradicting. Not only you're liable for worshiping, but you're even liable for just saying it. Even just saying it, you're liable. That's called a Lozu Avsu Katani. It's a standard type of Mishnah. And now we go up to this next discussion, which is a very powerful discussion. And there's the Mishnah says, one who worships the idolatry out of love or out of fear. So what does Rashi say this means? Rashi says, he's serving it either because he loves the person says, listen, standard way in the Bible that Rashi has this in the Bible. A woman says, you want to marry me? Well, you got to love my God. So he says, okay, I love your God, but he doesn't really love it. He's just saying it because he loves her. Or Meira, he's afraid that if he doesn't worship, he's going to get killed. This reminds me of a famous joke, the guy who serves God out of love. It's not a nice joke, but should I say it anyway? Yeah. Yeah. All right, I'll pause the recording, just you never know. Okay, so Rashi says, the joke was not funny. Rashi says that this is out of love and out of fear is out of love of a person, out of fear of a person. Rambam gives a different explanation. Rambam says that Ahava means that he sees it and he thinks, wow, he sees this idol. Like, you go to one of these European cities and you see this beautiful idol and he says, wow, this is such a beautiful getchka, such a beautiful idol. And means to say, and then as a result of it, he's worried. He just loves it so much that he wants to worship it. Or he's so worried that maybe it's so powerful that it'll hurt him. He doesn't think it's a god. And so anyway, this is like our Rambam doesn't say out of love or fear. So according to Rashi, it's a classic question on Rashi. Well, if it's out of fear, isn't that Yarod V'Yavor? So you're supposed to give your life. So we have to say that, yeah, if you didn't give your life, you're supposed to give your life. But if you didn't give your life, you're exempt because of the extenuating circumstances. Yeah.
Here, we talk about it's two kinds of forms of connecting respect. Not so much that but it's the idols, so also
right. So that's kind of like what the Rambam was saying. The Meiri talks about another case where we were talking about, let's say the king makes a cross for his own honor, and he says you have to honor it because he commands it, but not because of God. There's a whole question. When you greet somebody, typically you bow your head, greetings, you take off your hat, you give all sorts of greetings. And the person you're greeting to is wearing some sign of their God on them. Are you allowed to do it? So the Ramah is strict here, according to Trumas Hadeshin, and says you should be careful not to give that greeting under those circumstances, not to bow down in that manner. We'll see. Tosfos discusses what was the sin of why didn't Mordechai bow down to Haman? And so some say Haman was wearing an idol on himself. That's what the Tosfos says. So Abai says that you're liable, and Rav Amar Pater. Abai Amar Chayev Da'apolcha. you worshipped it, and there's no distinction why. Rav Amar Potter, it's about what was your intent. Did you accept him as your God? So that's a fundamental dispute. And how do we remember this? It's such a beautiful. This is the rabbis. You just look at the Talmud. So they gave him a way to remember it. What's the way to remember it? Eved yishtachave l'Mashiach. A slave will bow down to Messiah, to the Mashiach. You're not bowing down to an idol. To the Mashiach. That's what you remember it. Amar Abaye Menana Mila. How do I know that you're liable? Nitzanan, because we weren't in the Mishnah. Oved Avodas Kachavim Echad Oved. My love Echad Oved Me'avayim. It says if you serve out of love or fear, you're liable. We don't care why you serve. Rav Amarcha. Lo, Rabbi Yirmiyah. No, it doesn't mean that you worship even out of love or fear, but it's like Rabbi Yirmiyah said, that the Gemara says, what does it mean? It means that one who worships it in the normal manner is liable, but if you worship in the irregular manner, you're only liable if you did it in one of the four ways that you typically worship Hashem, which is slaughtering, incense, libation, and bowing down. Abaye gives another approach. I'm Abaye Menana Mila. How do I know Menana Mila? How do you know you're liable? The Tanya, because it serves, it says, we said this yesterday in the verse. You do not bow down to them. You're not allowed to bow down to them. But you're allowed to bow down to a person. I might think, it says, I might think you're even allowed to bow down to a person who makes himself like a god, like Haman. Like Haman makes himself a god. Because Haman made himself like an idolatry. Otherwise, why didn't Mordechai bow down to him? Why didn't Mordechai bow down to him? Look at Rashi, Rashi says, Haman made himself like an idolatry. Otherwise, Mordechai would not have gotten upset. So they have to say that Haman made himself like a god, even though the text of the Megillah never says that explicitly. You're not allowed to worship them. So you're not allowed to worship Haman. But Haman was doing it out of fear. So they were only bowing down out of fear. So this proves like Abaye, because otherwise Mordechai would have bowed down. Rav Amar, Kahaman, Rav would say no. Kahaman will Kahaman. Kahaman the iu gufe avodas kachavim. Meaning to say, what does it mean that you're liable if it's like Haman, partially but not entirely? If he himself makes himself like idolatry, then you can't bow down. Partially like Haman, you can't worship a person who himself is an idol, but not if it's out of fear, then it's not a problem. So according to this, Mordechai should have, since we paskin like Rava, so therefore, if that's the case, Mordechai should have been able to bow down. That's why the other rabbis got upset at him. It says in Megillah that they got upset at Mordechai. You caused this. You should have bowed down. So another attempt, last one of the day, the last attempt, we'll say, Amar Abaye. But no, you know, how do I know if you worship God out of fear, you're liable? The Tanya, Kohen Mashiach, the Kohen Gadol who was anointed, he's liable for a sin offering by Avodas Kochavim if he accidentally worships idolatry. Rabbi Omer B'Shiglas Ma'isa. What does that mean? Rabbi says this means when he does accidentally an action. L'chamim Omer B'Helam Davar, meaning to say he forgot that there's a prohibition for idolatry. So why does the Kohen HaMashiach have to bring it? Either if he accidentally worshiped, or according to Rabbi, if he forgot that idolatry was prohibited. But they both agree that if the Kohen HaMashiach was liable to bring the sin offering, he has to bring it kiyachid, meaning like an individual. And they both agree that he does not bring a asham talai for this. So that the Gemara says, what is the example where he accidentally worships idolatry through an action? If he thinks, oh, this is a synagogue, I'll bow down, and it turns out to be something he's not allowed to. Hooray. He intended for heaven, so that was not a bad act. Ella the chazi andarta. But rather, he saw an idol on in the form of a king, and they typically used to bow down to it in honor of the king, and they worshiped idolatry. And he bowed down to it, and he didn't realize that that was an idol. Now, if he had accepted that it was God, that would be idolatry without a sacrifice. If he doesn't realize it's God, it's nothing. Now, shouldn't it be? It's me'avan yeres. In the case we're talking about a love or fear. It's ba'omer mutter. It's where he thought it was permitted to worship the idolatry because he says there's no prohibition in the Torah. Gemara says, well, isn't that the same as olam davar? He didn't realize omer mutter. I know olam davar. No, Gemara says ba'omer mutter is legamri. You think it's completely permitted. He thought there's no prohibition of idolatry. Olam davar is kiyum mikzas to bitul mikzas. But the case of olam davar doesn't mean that he totally forgot about it. He just thinks that there's a portion of the prohibition, but not the entire prohibition. And this is the case of one who serves God out of love or fear. We paskin like Abai, we paskin like Rava, in this case. Tomorrow's going to discuss it more in tomorrow's daf. But for now, we'll stop here. We have Benedict Shir at 9:30 today. I'll tell you another story. One time.